Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to tackle a huge topic, the 350-year journey that led to the Constitution of India. It's a fascinating story that doesn't start with politicians, but actually with merchants, and it ends with the birth of a brand new nation. All right, let's dive right in.
Okay, so before we really get into the nitty-gritty, let's just take a step back and get the bird's eye view. This timeline here, it maps out our entire 350-year story. We start with a simple trading charter way back in 1600, and we end up with the supreme law of the land in 1950. And trust me, each of these dates marks a huge fundamental shift in how India was governed.
Right, so how are we going to tackle this massive history? Well, we've broken it down into 5 clear phases. We're going to follow the story from a trading company to a ruling power, and finally to a fully independent republic. This way, you'll see exactly how the building blocks of the modern Indian state were put in place, piece by piece.
All right, let's start at the very beginning. Our story kicks off not with a government, but with a corporation, the East India Company. And get this, it received its royal charter on the very last day of the year 1600. This charter basically gave it the exclusive right to trade in the East.
Now, here's the real game changer, the grant of Divani in 1765. And you really got to understand this. This wasn't just about permission to collect taxes. No, it was way bigger than that. It was about gaining real sovereign power. Once the company could decide civil cases, it stopped being just a bunch of merchants and became a genuine territorial ruler. This is the moment everything, and I mean everything, changed.
So, what happens next? Well, as the company got bigger and more powerful, stories of massive corruption and terrible mismanagement started flooding back to London. Things got so bad that the British Parliament felt it had no choice but to step in and try to, well, regulate the very monster it had helped create.
And that brings us to the Regulating Act of 1773. This was it. This was the very first major attempt by the British government to get a handle on the East India Company's frankly out-of-control power in India.
Now, what's really important to see here is how this act laid the groundwork for a centralized administration. Think about it. They took the governor of Bengal, made him the governor general, that was Warren Hastings, and then made the other big regions, Bombay and Madras, report to him. For the first time, you have a single top-down authority. That's a huge step.
But they didn't stop there. Just a decade or so later, you get the Pitt's India Act of 1784, and this one goes even further. For the very first time, it officially calls the company's territories the British possessions in India. There was no more pretending. This made it crystal clear who was really in charge.
So what did this act actually do? Well, it created this clever system of dual control. It basically drew a line in the sand. On one side, you have the company's business, its commercial stuff. On the other, you have politics and governing. And the act made sure the British government was firmly in charge of that political side of things.
Now, if you look at the charter acts that followed, you can see a really clear trend. In 1813, they end the company's monopoly on trade. In 1833, they create the Governor-General of India, centralizing power even more. And by 1853, they're separating the law-making and law-executing jobs. See the pattern? Step by step, they're stripping the company of its business side and turning it into a government on behalf of the crown.
And then came 1857, the Great Revolt. This was the ultimate turning point, an absolute earthquake that shook the system to its core. In its aftermath, there was no going back. The East India Company was done. It was completely abolished, and this marks the beginning of direct, official rule by the British Crown.
So you can see here just how much things changed. Before, you had the company in charge. After, it's the British Crown. The old Governor-General, he gets a new title, Viceroy, which means he's the direct representative of the monarch. And back in London, they create a whole new cabinet post, the Secretary of State for India, to be the big boss in charge of it all.
This all happened under the Government of India Act of 1858, and you gotta love the name. They called it the Act for the Good Government of India. Kind of ironic, right? But what it did was completely dismantled the old company system. All government, all territory, all revenue, it was all formally handed over to the Crown. And Lord Canning became the very first Viceroy, kicking off this new era of direct rule.
Okay, this next concept is absolutely crucial to understand, so let's pause here for a second. We're talking about the Indian Councils Act of 1909, also known as the Morley-Minto Reforms. This act introduced something called a separate communal electorate.
What does that mean? It means members of a specific religion, in this case Muslims, could only vote for candidates from their own community. This is often seen as the moment the British government legally enshrined the politics of division in India, and its consequences, well, they would be felt for decades to come. All right, as we push into the 20th century, the whole dynamic starts to shift. The next phase is really defined by two things happening at once. You've got a growing, powerful nationalist movement demanding more control, and you've got the British trying to manage that by introducing reforms for more, and I stress more, Indian participation in government. So, in 1919, they came up with this really complicated system called diarchy, which basically means double government. In the provinces, they split all the subjects into two lists. You had reserved subjects, the really important stuff like finance and law, which the British governor kept total control over. And then you had transferred subjects, think agriculture, health, which were handed over to Indian ministers. It was a messy, flawed experiment for sure, but you can actually see the seeds of India's future federal system right here.
And it wasn't just diarchy. The 1919 Act brought in some other things that might sound pretty familiar. For the first time, it introduced bicameralism, that's a two-house legislature, at the central level. Sound familiar? It should. It also required that some members of the Viceroy's own executive council had to be Indian, and it set up a public service commission. You can really see the structure of the modern state starting to take shape.
So by 1927, the British decide it's time to review how that 1919 Act is working out. They set up a commission, the Simon Commission, to do just that. But there was one massive, glaring problem. The commission was all British. Not a single Indian member was included to discuss the future of India's own government. As you can imagine, that did not go down well, at all. And the reaction was immediate and universal. Simon, go back. That became the rallying cry. It was everywhere. Mass protests erupted across the country, with Indians from every political party united in their boycott. The message was loud and clear. We will have a say in our own future.
All those protests, all the roundtable conferences, it all eventually led to this, the Government of India Act of 1935. Now this one is a big deal. It was the longest, most detailed constitutional document the British ever produced for India. And here's the kicker, a massive chunk of India's current constitution, things like the division of powers into federal, provincial, and concurrent lists, is lifted almost directly from this 1935 Act.
And that brings us to the final chapter, the home stretch. We're now in the 1940s. World War II is raging, the British Empire is weakening, and Indian independence is no longer a question of if, but when and how. The transfer of power is right around the corner. Things started moving really fast at this point. First, you had the Cripps mission in 1942, which failed. But then, in 1946, the Cabinet mission came along, and its plan for creating a Constituent Assembly, a body to write the Constitution, actually stuck. So right after the Indian Independence Act was passed in 1947, this assembly, with Dr. Rajendra Prasad as its president, got down to business. And leading the charge was the drafting committee, with the brilliant Dr. B.R. Ambedkar as its chairman. Just imagine the task ahead of them, to write a single rulebook for a brand new, incredibly diverse nation. It took them 2 years, 11 months, and 18 days of intense debate and hard work to draft the final document that would guide India's destiny. So there you have it. From a private company's charter to the world's longest written constitution, it's an incredible journey. And if there's one thing to take away, it's this. India's constitution wasn't just written in a few years. It was forged over centuries of trial and error, of reforms, protests, and debates. Every single act we talked about, every struggle, it was all a building block. So as you look at India today, it makes you wonder, doesn't it? Which of these historical building blocks do you think is the most important for understanding the country now?